Now, the Presidential Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms Committee has said that it is working on a system that will provide tax relief to 95% of the informal sector of the economy in the country. Chairman of the committee, Mr. Taiwo, Oyedele, stated this at the closing session of the committee on Sunday in Abuja. According to him, this will be achieved through the exemption of businesses earning 25 million naira a year or less from the various taxes hindering their progress over time. Now, joining me to discuss this further is Abiodun Kayode-Alli, who is Economist and Tax Senior Manager at PwC Nigeria. Abiodun, it's a pleasure to have you. Good morning to you.
Thank you for having me.
Most welcome. Now, when we look around the world, there is sort of a similar pattern when it comes to sort of trust deficit between the government and the informal sectors, especially when it comes to paying taxes. Why would you say this is?
Okay, so generally, if you consider it, no one likes to pay taxes, and that's a word everyone would love to avoid. Even the rich and mighty, they've been accused so many times of being immoral by not paying taxes. So it's a general trend. But I would say the difference between the developed world and the developing world is that in most instances, you can see the outcome of the taxes that are being collected. So the more they pay the taxes, the more you see the benefits, right? But that might not necessarily be the case, especially in developing countries where there is a lot of complaint and there's that huge trust deficit, which I can even reference a particular research work that was sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where the Nigerian Economic Summit Group actually tried to decipher the tax morale, the willingness to pay tax of Nigerians. And it was discovered that majority of Nigerians don't want to pay tax because they don't trust that the government would make judicious use of their resources. They also don't trust that the tax collectors will actually account for such taxes. And there is also that issue with the knowledge of the taxes to pay. So currently our tax system is a bit complex, which is the reason why the committee is actually working on simplifying taxes, make it easily understandable to the common man. So if you consider the tenets of taxation, which was introduced by Adam Smith, who is known as the modern founder of economics, he says that principles that should entail a tax system should be things such as certainty, simplicity, and fairness. So I think in our own state, a lot more needs to be done to bridge this gap by simplifying things and showing people the benefits of the taxes they pay. Right,
so this trust deficit comes from a lack of accountability and transparency to begin with on both parts. So both parties are not so sure of what the outcome would be in comparison to other worlds. So that's very fair analysis on that. But what do you make of this quote from Taiwo Oyedele, who is the chairman of the Presidential Tax Committee? He says, and I quote, "We think that the informal sector are people who are trying to earn a legitimate living. We should allow them to be and support them to grow to a point where they can then have the ability to pay taxes," end of quote.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair quote, and it's actually the truth. There is no point. The expectation is that taxes should be income taxes should be based on profits you make, right? So you need to first of all be profitable before you begin to pay taxes. In a situation where you are now beginning to tax the capital, right? These companies, these individuals, the informal sector, they are not making profits, they are not generating much revenue, and you begin to tax them. It discourages them. It causes an issue when it comes to the ease of doing business, right? So if you look at the informal sector, like you referenced, these are people who they are trying to make ends meet, right? Trying to get by and by. They are limited in terms of choices, in terms of capabilities. They are even trying to get basic amenities which government is supposed to provide to them, but unfortunately, they are not getting it in terms of water, in terms of sanitation, in terms of schools, right? So they are not getting these things. Then taxing them further is not something they would like to hear. And you could see the reactions that came in when we heard about the cybersecurity levy and even the talks about increasing VAT. Everyone was actually resistant to that, given the fact that inflation is on the high in Nigeria. You know, in 2022, the National Bureau of Statistics actually conducted a research on the poverty level in Nigeria, the multidimensional poverty. And it was said that about 63% of Nigerians are living in multidimensional poverty. What that simply means is that they don't have access to basic things that they should have, things such as health, sanitation, education, and even a secure job, right? They don't have access to these things. So taxing them for that won't do them any good. Back back then in 2022, when this particular research was conducted, inflation was somewhere within the range of 21%. Now inflation is 33.2%. Even back then, the exchange rate was somewhere within the range of 448 naira to the dollar. We know what it is. It's way higher now. So it just brings that sense and the need to actually consider exempting them till they become profitable and they can add to the economy in terms of employment, in terms of output. Then you can begin to tax them when they become profitable.
I certainly hear you on that, but then again, in following up with that, considering the fact that the informal sector actually makes up such a large part of Nigeria's economy and employment, what would you say to the argument that this sector should in fact pay more taxes? That's a whole other school of thought around it.
I totally don't agree with that school of thought, and I'm sure most Nigerians watching wouldn't either. Because if you think about it, they are trying to make ends meet, right? So if you look at them, I'm talking about people in the category of, take for instance, the vulcanizers, people like the hawkers, right? So these are people who they live on a daily basis from what they actually make, right? From hand to mouth. So if you consider the fact that they don't even have that much and you want to begin to tax them, let's not forget that we have lots of non-state actors who are actually doing a lot of the taxation. And the interesting thing is that the amounts being collected by non-state actors don't end up in government coffers. There was a report that was released by the International Center for Investigative Reporting in 2021. Do you know the interesting thing, Abi? The report stated that what is being collected by touts, who we know as agberos in Lagos, they generate about 123 billion annually in Lagos State. Apart from Lagos and apart from Rivers, other states don't generate up to that amount in terms of IGR taxes from their own respective state. And we have these non-state actors generating this amount. If you look at the buses, right, the commercial buses, they pay lots of levies, right, before they start their operation. Pure water sellers. There was even a time in Marina, I was passing by and I saw some of these non-state actors trying to seize the wheelbarrow of someone who was pushing it, right? So you asking, they're already paying enough taxes, right? So at this point in time, I think it's just ideal to follow the quote of the president, which says, let the poor breed. I think that will be ideal at this point. And
you are the voice of the people right now, I have to tell you that a bit. But let's look at the Presidential Tax Committee wants to exempt 95% and instead focus on the top 5%. What do you think of the strategy?
Yeah, I think it's a very good thing. So if you look at other countries, other jurisdictions, South Africa, for instance, they generate a lot of taxes, especially from personal income tax, which is the income tax that you pay as an individual, right? But in Nigeria, what we generate is so low. So if I compare what Nigeria, being the giant of Africa and being the largest economy, right? Nigeria is generating about less than $30 billion, right, in terms of taxes. South Africa, on the other hand, is doing over 100, right? And most of these taxes are coming from personal income tax. Nigeria, on the other hand, personal income tax is a very small percentage, about 17%. So it only makes sense to say that there are a lot of high net worth individuals who are actually not paying the right share of taxes, right? So what do we then do with respect to these guys? And that's where the president of this committee is someone who I know places a high premium on data. He's trying to see how we can capture and begin to bring in these high net worth individuals into the tax net. And that's why he's trying as much as he can to reduce the number of taxes and focus on only those that can generate the needed revenue to move the country forward. So it's a sensible move and it makes a lot of sense. Some of the taxes that the poor actually pay are things like value-added taxes on products, right? And even companies' income tax, like we saw in your intro, they've been exempted, right? I know this committee is trying to increase that threshold such that there will be further exemptions for the poor. I believe Nigeria can make a lot of revenue if we get it right in terms of data and in terms of capturing those who ought to pay to make them pay. So I think it's actually a good thing. Talking
about data and finer details, let's look at the tax collection process in itself. What role can technology play in its seamlessness? Or to make it a lot more effective? Yeah, so technology can actually do a lot. I remember, if I'll just cite the example of companies' income tax, for instance. So the Federal Inland Revenue Service, the FRS, they are responsible for collecting taxes from companies, right? One thing they've done is to introduce technology. I remember prior to the introduction of this technology, we would see a situation where we would go to their offices on the date where we're expected to file tax returns, and we go there with volumes
forms of documents, right? So apart from the fact that this process was inefficient and it wasn't also good in terms of climate, right? Technology would actually help to reduce all this. It makes it comfortable and seamless. You can pay your taxes right from the comfort of your homes or anywhere in the world, right? So one thing technology brings is efficiency. Then apart from that, it also helps in identifying individuals who ought to pay taxes, right? So we've seen instances where we don't know, we're unable to capture these people, right? But with technology, from the activities being carried out by these people, probably like the chairman normally says, from the phone calls you make, he can know who should be paying tax and who shouldn't. Those who probably flash or those who probably low amounts definitely shouldn't be paying taxes, but those who load high amount, from your activities, your banking activities, you can actually capture those who are probably should be in the tax net but actually aren't. And there are other countries who have done this. Rwanda is a very good example. They've been able to increase their tax collection by identifying and by putting in place appropriate technology to identify those who ought to pay. You can introduce technology even at the point of sales terminals, right? Such that you can see taxes that should be collected on a real-time basis. And I know the FRS is doing that from some retail stores, right? So I think it's something that will help, especially at the subnational level, in consolidating taxes. So I think it would do a lot of good. So
the potential for that is undeniable, right? But for technology to work efficiently, doesn't it then require input? Again, we're going back to the beginning of this conversation, from the players in the tax-paying sectors.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely it does, right? So first and foremost, I think one thing we need to get right is centralizing our data, right? So take, for instance, we have lots of identification numbers, right? If it's not your BVN, you have your national identification number, you have different forms of number. I think one thing we need to do is to centralize it. Kenya is doing something similar, whereby even from childhood stage, you get a unique identification number, and by the time you turn 18, that becomes your national identification number. So I think that's one thing we need to do, right? Then also, I think one other important thing that one needs to do is also to speak to the states, for instance, right? So the states can actually learn a lot from the federal level. The federal has shown efficiency in terms of adopting technology to collect these taxes. So I think that's something also the state needs to do. Then they need to work alongside with different stakeholders like the telecom sector, right? You don't want a situation whereby you have issues with network or things not going on time, leading to disruption in the system. So I think Nigeria has actually matured to the point whereby we can actually make this work. So yes, it will play a significant role. Every actor needs to come on board.
Right. I like that you mentioned the states, because the Presidential Tax Committee also says that it's speaking to the states around the country to get rid of what is termed nuisance taxes. Firstly, how important is it to get rid of, and what are nuisance taxes? Okay,
so the nuisance taxes will simply be, like I made mention of, there are lots of taxes that are being collected that do not get into state coffers, right? So a lot of these taxes, and basically, if you will be surprised about the list of informal taxes that we have, right? You have over 200 taxes, right, that are not official, and this actually puts a lot of burden, right? So at one point, it might seem like the state is actually collecting a lot of revenue, but the problem is that there is a lot of inefficiency, right? There is a lot of leakage. If they could just focus on single taxes, right? Single taxes that are well known, and that's why the committee is trying as much as possible to streamline this amount of taxes. One thing that a report as published by the World Bank or probably the IMF, I can't remember which of these organizations published, is that the more taxes you have, the less clarity that is now being received. And because of this low clarity that we have, it now becomes so easy for most of these taxes collected to actually go through unauthorized corners, right? So they don't eventually get it. If they can actually focus on consolidating the number of taxes that they have, and they do so efficiently, they'll realize that they are raking in much more than they're actually collecting. So they need to buy into this particular initiative. And I understand that for any state who eventually doesn't buy in, if they still continue to collect these taxes, there is a way, a kind of reconciliation will be done, right, even at the federal level, to probably reduce the allocation to such states. But I believe that the committee will provide more clarity on that subsequently.
So better organization and coordination could be what we're missing here. But if we want to get a bit more granular about it, Nigerian states, quite a number of them are owing a number of salaries and pensions as we speak, even with these nuisance taxes. How important is it to get rid of this? And will there be some sort of resistance on the part of the states in this regard?
Well, I really can't say, but generally every state is interested in generating revenue. One thing I know is that regardless of the pushback that comes from these states, if they key into this particular initiative, it will help them in the long run. And this has helped other countries. So because in other countries, we have just one single revenue authority collecting taxes. So I think if they can key into this initiative, they will do better in terms of their collections.
Great. So great potential ahead. We just have to keep our eyes peeled and hope that everything works out for best. Abiodun, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the Global Business Report.